Welcome back, everyone. It's nice to see you back again. I hope you had a nice little rest. This is our final session, which will include advice, predictions, recommended initiatives, and the prospect of a changing paradigm for international travel. We've got a top panel waiting, who I'll introduce in a second, but I'm first joined by Gerald Lawless, who's been name-checked before, I noticed, WTTC Ambassador, Director of the ITIC, and Advisory Board Member of Dubai Expo 2020. Gerald, hello. You've had long experience in your time with Jumeirah Hotels and your time in the Middle East, and I believe you've written a report for the WTTC on the importance of sustainability in this recovery period. Can you explain what your thoughts are on that, please?
Yes, thank you very much, Rajan, and hello everybody. It's been great to have so many fantastic panelists with us all day today. I really enjoy the input from everybody. And yes, no, I just wrote a paper some time ago, quite a short one, believe it or not. And really what I was talking about this time as we reboot tourism, as tourism comes back, and tourism for sure will come back. And I do not believe that people will not want to travel. I think they'll want to travel even more than before because they've been denied it for a few months. But I do believe that it's really important for the industry that this time we bring the environmentalists along with us. We've got to convince the environmentalists that we are not a bad situation for sustainability. I believe in two types of sustainability: environmental sustainability and social sustainability. And when we look at the value and the good that tourism does worldwide, we heard Minister Bilala talking about how important it is to countries like Kenya, for so many countries throughout Africa, where our industry, and I know I'm telling everybody what they know already, but our industry puts so much good directly into developing communities, into communities that need the cash. Now, we've really got to make sure that the environmentalists understand that we are actually a force for good. We have got to understand within the industry that climate change people are not wrong. And actually, we need to work with them to ensure that our industry can be sustainable for the long term. And that's why I believe we need to continue to work hard to engage with environmentalists to say, okay, let's look at the good things that we're doing, and let's look at the things that are not so good, and let's look at what we can do better. And particularly, I always feel very sad for the airline industry that they get accused of being such a bad force for the environment. But when we look at the total carbon emissions of aviation, it's less than 3%. So we really do have to look to say, what can we do at the same time to make sure that development is ongoing, that we really are doing something in terms of research environmentally for biofuels, for everything that will ultimately fuel aircraft in a more environmentally friendly way. Similarly, and again, it's a bit of a worry, I think the big hotel groups and even small hotels have done very well in getting rid of single-use plastic in the environment and in their rooms and everything that they're doing. But now, unfortunately, with our efforts to contain the virus, we're bringing back this use of single-use plastic. So we really have a challenge there. But this challenge, I think, is something that we need to join together. And what I would love to see, actually, is a very well independent, accepted documentary being made. There you are, Rajan, maybe by the BBC. Maybe we could even have Mr. Attenborough coming on as well to say, well, right, here are the challenges for the industry, but here's also the good that they are doing. And here's why we must continue to drive the tourism industry for the future, for the good of society, and for the good of business, and for the good of the economy. So that's my little tuppence halfpenny worth on the economy. Sorry, on sustainability. But I do believe so strongly in that, and I think it's something we should not lose sight of.
Can I come back to you then on that? Because obviously just before COVID, all the talk in tourism was about over-tourism. We've mentioned this before, and the trend towards flight shaming, the whole notion of, hang on, people taking too many flights. There's no turning back now. And, you know, in a sense, you're right. How can you persuade the environmental lobby that this industry does want to work in tandem with them?
Well, surely. I mean, one particular example I would give you in my original home country of Ireland. We have had over-tourism in certain parts of Dublin and certain parts of the southwestern Killarney. And then some genius some years ago came up with this idea, wow, we've got 2,100 kilometers of Atlantic coastline on the western seaboard of Ireland. So from the north to the south, all the way down to 2,100 kilometers, they introduced what they called the Wild Atlantic Way. And in that, they signposted all of it. They went to the small villages, which economically were dying actually because of so much urbanization in Ireland, and said, look, we need to have more bed and breakfast. We need to have more Airbnb type facilities. We need to introduce more and more tourists coming to Ireland to discover the benefits of the Western seaboard. And what they've done is you can cycle, they've signposted the whole 2,100 kilometers. You can cycle it, you can walk it, you can drive it. You're hopefully a bit like the Camino in Spain. You will come back every year to complete some more of it. You get a passport when you come to the airport in Dublin, and you can have this passport stamped every year. And actually it's taking tourism from the major big centers into areas that will really benefit from tourism, and tourism will benefit so much from being able to go there. So it's just an example, but there are ways to actually divert tourism from the areas that are oversubscribed into areas that are just as attractive, but we really have to concentrate with the tourism development boards to be able to get this business into more remote areas that people would truly enjoy.
I think, I think we're right, and I think the world will be paying attention to the tourism industry as to what they are doing in this regard, because it's a very visible industry for a lot of people. Now, the other thing I know you want to talk about is COVID testing, and there does seem to be a lot of confusion around it. What's your view on this? How can we make this simple?
Well, I don't want to take too much time because I know we have fantastic panelists that hear what they've got to say, but I do believe that testing and tracking, but testing is so important. In the United Arab Emirates have already completed over 2 million tests in a country of less than 10 million people. Then having done that, and I've been approached by a company actually in Singapore, who are a startup was very interested to develop this forward, and the WTTC is looking at it at the moment, and that it's called Trust Scan, where using quick read QR codes, you will be able to have on your phone exactly what your status is in relation to COVID. Have you had it? Are you immune? Have you been tested? Have you not been tested? You can carry this. Either ultimately it could be within the chip in your passport, or you have it on your Trust Scan QR reader. And ultimately, this is where we have to go. That all of us, as much as possible, if we want to travel, we have to get tested. I think this can be experimented with the business community. Business travel will come back, believe it or not. And we won't always be on Zoom. We will be traveling to conferences and conventions, I'm positive. But we do need to get this scanning put in. I mean, we have now Germany saying that they're putting out travel warnings, only travel within Europe. Well, why not travel to a place like the United Arab Emirates? But if you had this kind of QR process on your phones, you could actually encourage it a lot more. Anyway, Rajan, I think that's enough for me, and I think a big panel to talk to. But thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you to all our delegates for attending today.
Thank you, Gerald. Stick around because we are going to have some conversation between all of the panel. Just to let you know, we will be hearing soon from Christopher Rodriguez, WTTC ambassador and former boss of Visit Britain, Ambassador Do Young Shim from South Korea, Haitam Mata, Middle East tourism expert and CEO Beyond Tourism, and Todorle, marketing advisor, Ministry of Tourism, Bulgaria. Sadly, the minister from Bulgaria, Nikolina, was supposed to be here, but unfortunately she's been taken unwell, and I think she's fine, she's recovering. But before we get to any of those people, and Taleb as well, of course, will be in that fray, let's hear a couple of, let's get some insights and shed some light on how the future looks with two presentations. The first one is from Margaux Constantin, who's a partner at McKinsey company. Hello, Margaux. I think we have to.
Hello. Yeah.
How many times have you heard this thing where we have to say unpress the mute button? Anyway, it's all yours. The floor is yours, Margaux.
Hi, I'm very excited to be with all of you today. I think and I'm just going to briefly project this, so bear with me for a minute. I think what I just wanted to use of the 10 minutes or so is a bit of a broad recap on what are some of the trends and facts we're seeing across different elements of the value chain of the industry. I think a lot of this you'll obviously have seen, you'll be familiar with, maybe some of the aspects of the value chain that you're less close to. I hope I'll leave you with some interesting reflections. So 3 brief chapters, and I'll walk through this quite quickly. First is how do we expect the impact to look like in 2020 and the recovery in the coming years? What are some early learnings that we see from how China is recovering, which type of segments, which types of trips? And finally, what can we do in terms of recovery response, whether it's hotels or governments? So in the first one, as McKinsey and Company, we've developed 2 different scenarios for the global air travel demand, which includes both domestic flights and international flights, but it doesn't include sort of car trips, rail trips. One is where the virus gets contained basically now, and tourism gets restarted relatively quickly. We don't have a major supply issue in terms of all of their airlines discontinuing a lot of the routes. And so in that scenario, we expect about a 50% drop in air travel. And by Q1 2021, we would meet sort of where we were in 2019. And by 2023, we would meet the pre-crisis trajectory. In the second scenario, we would expect sort of a double dip in the virus with maybe a second period of lockdown. We would also expect that there's a lot of airline capacity that doesn't come back, which then takes a very long time for the industry to get restarted. We'd have about a 60% and it takes until 2023 for air travel to recover. This is in RPKs, right? So it shows volume. It doesn't really show value. What we've done in value, just to give you a sense and complement a little bit this, is we've looked at the spend for the top 10 largest source markets. So China, US, Germany, etc. Domestic and international business and leisure. And if we look at the economic forecasts for these countries, we expect that tourism spend will take in the first scenario until 2024 to recover, and in the second scenario until 2026. So spend will take a little bit longer. Less so in 2020 because people are very eager to spend right now after confinement, and they still have their wages subsidized by governments in many parts of the world. But from 2021, we expect this to be felt more strongly. So now that we've talked a little bit about 2020 and what things can look like in the long term, of course, what everybody is really interested in right now is understanding what does it look like really now in the next 4 weeks, in the next 3 months. And we'll see what happens next year. And so what we've tried to do is we've developed with Iata a travel recovery dashboard. And so what this basically looks at is which countries are researching travel, which countries are researching flights, and then which countries are actually purchasing flights, and how is that evolving on a week-by-week basis. And of course, the idea is, countries that are researching travel a lot are likely to then be researching travel a lot, flights a lot, and if they're searching flights, they're then likely to actually purchase the flight. Just to make this a little bit more concrete, I've tried to pull out an example so that that this resonates a little bit in terms of the trends that we're seeing. So I took the example from searches and bookings of flight tickets from Europe to Africa, just to make this a little bit concrete. And so what you see on the map is week-on-week changes in search and ticketing behavior. And so basically you see a lot of blue sort of around Western Europe. And what that means is week-on-week Western Europe is increasingly searching tickets to Africa. Even if they're not booking it, they're searching a lot. Then what you see in the bar charts on the right is how is the searching and ticketing behavior looking like compared to the previous year. And so actually January, February were very, very strong. We were 200%, 130% above 2019. Things started getting bad in March. Obviously the last few months have been pretty bad. What is interesting though is the summer remains quite low. So July, August, September is about 50% of the previous year's level. If you would look at Europe domestic flights, the number is actually much higher, as Europe is announcing reopening. However, when you look at Africa starting October, you start seeing much better outlook, getting closer to 65%. So I think this is to say there is definitely, we were just talking about this desire to travel. People are searching. It's not quite yet to the 2019 levels, but it's important to keep monitoring this, that different destinations can know which countries are having interest for them. And so interestingly, the biggest one right now between Europe and Africa is France to Tunisia and Germany to Egypt. And so I'd let you speculate about why those routes, not others. Now let's switch a little bit to the early learnings from China. Of course, we're all looking very closely at China. All of you are, as they reopen a little bit faster than others. So the hotel industry is slowly recovering, given the large, domestic market that they have. So they're lucky to be one of the largest outbound source markets globally, and as they can travel out, they have a lot of pent-up demand. So, interestingly, average daily rates as of the 1st of June were about 30% below 2019 level, and RevPAR is about 60% below. And the so that's obviously that's not great, but that's also a relatively steady upward trajectory, which gives confidence to some of the stakeholders in China. Now, what is particularly interesting for us to look at is who is driving that recovery. So of course, domestic trips, much more than international trips. But even if you look at the airline ticket sales, the domestic airline ticket sales are not going back up quite that quickly. So a lot of the trips are actually traditional car trip, especially within 2-hour drive of some of the big cities such as Shanghai, Beijing, or Guangzhou. And during Labor Day, which is a public holiday that they have in China early May, all the very luxury hotels right outside of the big cities had 90 to 100% occupancy rates. When we look at which parts of the hotels are recovering faster in China, mid-scale and economy recovered much faster. The data that you see here is the month of March, and we chose the month of March because it was interesting to see the very rapid evolution. So mid-scale and luxury went from 24% occupancy rate to 50% in just 1 month. And that's partially because some of these facilities were still used as quarantine facilities, and partially because people are worried about their financing, and so they are switching to sort of more value products. Luxury is struggling the most. The exception to that is what I was just mentioning, these big public holidays where everyone went a bit cuckoo on spend. The average daily rate during the public holidays was 50% higher than in 2019, which is, just very biased to this luxury segment. The people who are traveling are much younger. That's not completely unexpected. Older generations are going to be much more worried about the health situation than younger generations. And the hotel booking lead times are very short. So in March, 90% of trips had a 1 week or less booking lead time, of course, because people want to know what's the latest information in terms of what they're allowed to do. Quarantine, no quarantine, they need to get tested before they travel, and so on and so forth. So the bookings are very short. What that means is that's putting a lot of pressure on everyone in the industry, from small SMEs to governments, to be extremely digitized, because that sort of very short booking lead time only works with a strong digitization booking system. Now, we all have to be aware that sort of what has happened in China was also supported by very extensive measures that were taken across the travel journey. I thought someone was, that are not necessarily accessible to all the countries in the world in terms of the QR codes, the checks, the sort of very technology-intensive process. So if we move on to the recovery response, just briefly, what can we expect in terms of traveler behavior? How do we see some of the big shifts in the tourism industry, and what can destinations do to remain competitive? And I'll skip some of the slides because I know we're sort of running out of time. I think two big things basically on traveler behavior. One is when we ask, this is an example from a European survey that we conducted in terms of intention to travel. The majority of people expect to roughly travel the same as they used to, both domestic and international. But in the very short term, rather biased towards domestic travel and an expectation to do less international travel. Now, when they do travel, there is a strong travel preference towards outdoor locations that are more naturally conducive to physical distancing. The top chart is actually from Skift. It's for the US source market, but we have run also our own surveys on other source markets, and we see very similar trends. So Sun and Beach, by far the biggest winner of all of this. We expect all-inclusive resorts to partially benefit from this because they are a combination of sun and beach, but a very self-contained environment that is easy to control in terms of protocols, etc. And so giving visitors that confidence to travel and that everything has been well contained and taken care of works quite well in that format. National parks, small countryside, and urban centers are the biggest losers in terms of what people state they want to travel. Now, what is very funny in all of these surveys is a big difference between what people say they want to do and what they end up actually doing. And so if you look at the bookings in September, hotel bookings in September in the US, the biggest winner of all is actually Las Vegas, where they're booking about 200% up compared to what they were last year. And the cruise bookings for 2021, 75% of the people who had their cruises canceled in 2020 opted for a rebooking in 2021 rather than a refund. So actually cruises and cities are seeing somewhat healthy booking. Now, despite that sort of desire and preference, of course, you're all well aware that travelers are very anxious to go back to the hotel. And so we try to understand what exactly are they anxious about returning to the hotel. And we ran a bunch of correlations and surveys on this. And what is quite interesting is what really makes them anxious is not the check-in, it's not the restaurant, it's not even the pool or the spa, it's their room. And then within the room, it's particularly staying in the bed. That is the highest driver of anxiety. And what would make travelers much more comfortable to travel is, of course, number one, having the room more clean, but number two, which is very, very important, having visible cues that show that things have been clean. And so this whole theater of cleanliness is very important for hotels, also for airlines and all other part of the value chain. People want to have this sort of constant confidence that things have happened. And so visible cues are almost more important than whatever else happens. Some of the big shifts in the industry, a few things that are going to be table stakes for hotels, flexible for hotels and airlines, flexible policies, very important. People want to know that they can easily change or cancel without penalty, increased transparency into health and safety protocols, sanitization measure, physical distancing measures. And so we've seen a lot of hotel brands, some of the big hotel brands try to go sort of very tech heavy to take this entire hotel journey as contactless as possible. That seems to be quite high on the mind of visitors. In terms of what destinations can do, what we've done is we sort of structured a little bit of what the typical government response looks like across three horizons: resisting, restarting, and reimagining. And it's very different types of interventions you would do at these different stages. Some countries have passed the resisting stage. Actually, a lot of them are still trying to figure out what are the adequate level of liquidity relief, how do we redeploy some of the assets in the short term, how do we maybe use this downtime, upgrade some of the facilities and push renovation funds and things like that. In terms of managing the return, lots of countries are pushing on domestic travels, whether through marketing, vouchers, subsidized airlines, protocol guidelines, of course, a very important theme for many countries right now in terms of the reopening, alongside things like travel bubbles to figure out which countries they're reopening with and under which protocol, as well as things like state-backed government insurance. Then everything around accelerating the coordination and digitization of the sector is important because SMEs are more likely than ever before to be left out of this equation in a context where the booking lead times are very short. And then in terms of reimagining a bit the sector, I think we see a lot of governments right now really trying to seize this as a unique opportunity to tackle some of the structural challenges of the sector that they might not have had the political momentum in the past to address. And we believe they're going to have to set up very different types of capabilities going forward, much more public-private partnership type of collaboration, the need for real-time data. So you won't be doing your strategy sort of every 3 years. You have to review a strategy every 3 months in partnership with all of the other stakeholders. And last but not least, we believe it's very important to set up a sort of centralized control tower to oversee that entire effort, which combines both public actors and private actors, as this goes well beyond the sort of typical historical natural realm of a tourism authority.
Very good, Margaux. Thank you very much indeed.
A very express one.
I think a lot of those points you make there have been touched on. For example, people looking for spaces, people, the kind of psychology of things. It's very interesting that you said that what people say they're going to do and what they actually do can vary. So that's good news potentially for urban locations and for cruises, which a lot of people have written off. But it's very interesting you say that. And then the other aspect that I think is also very important, and it relates to our next speaker, is talking about visible cues. People need to know and be reassured that their hotel room has just been cleaned. It's not just a question of it has been cleaned, it is they need to know that. So let's stick to the kind of crucial psychological and behavioral aspects of all this with our next speaker, our next guest, Ben Locke from Edelman, because basically we're dealing with the mindset of anxious travelers and crucially what will be needed to gain their trust. And Ben, you have done something called the Trust Barometer. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, indeed. Apologies. Yes. Thanks, Rajan. Yes, let me tell you a little bit about trust. Let me share my screen if I can work out how to. 1 second. Hopefully you can all see that.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, so over the next few minutes, I want to talk a bit about trust and the importance of trust. And at Edelman, we have been looking at trust now for 20 years. And what we do, we look at 4 institutions. We look at NGOs, media, government, and business. And over those 20 years, we've spoken to over 2 million people, over 400 companies, 80,000 employees. Why? Because trust is essential to success, not just on a societal level, on a company level. It matches across all different stakeholders. It informs decisions around purchases, loyalty, brand performance, market performance, resilience against risk. In fact, it is the ultimate currency in the way governments and organizations operate today. So let's look at the latest results for 2020. Perhaps I should do a short disclaimer here. It's not a positive picture. In fact, the results are pretty grim. This year we looked at, we interviewed 34,000 people across 26 different markets, 18 plus, but this year we slightly oversampled on that important generation Z, the 18 to 24-year-olds. And the people we speak to encompass both the informed publics, and by that I mean people who are college educated, in the top 25% income bracket, and who actively consume business and political news. And then the 83% is the mass population. And we look at 2020, whilst trust has gone up 1% from the previous year, it's still in the neutral zone at 54%. And it is worth saying when this was done in October to November 2019. None of us ever heard of Corona at that stage. So remember, if you can, back then, there were relatively rising positive news around rising stock markets, low unemployment. It was a rosier picture, and yet trust was incredibly low. And in fact, developing markets tend to have higher trust than developed markets. Look right down there at the US, UK, Australia, and Germany. In fact, 12 out of the 26 markets are distrusters. And we see significant declines in Saudi, and UAE, Hong Kong, Canada, and US. And what we're seeing more of is a trust inequality. So trust is far greater for those who are more affluent, the more informed public, than for the mass population. 2/3 of the informed public across the markets are trusting compared to just 6 countries in the mass population space. In fact, the majority of the mass population lives in markets where less than half trust their institutions to do what is right. And if we look across all 4 institutions, it's even more stark. The mass population distrusts their governments, their media, and they only just trust, at 55%, both business and worryingly NGOs. And in the early days of doing trust, NGOs were the bastion of hope. They were beyond reproach, and they're only now at 55%. So why is this? Well, clearly, there is an underlying issue around concerns about their future. People are uneasy about their future from an economic perspective. More than half of the markets have populations where the majority do not believe they or their families will be better off in 5 years' time. And not a single developed market is on the more optimistic side of the chart, with numbers below 1 in 4 in Germany, in France, in Japan, and the UK. And compounding this sense of pessimism is a sense that people are being left behind. People worry about losing the respect and the dignity they once enjoyed. As the speed of cultural and demographic changes ramps up, people are struggling to see their place in the future. And as a result, people are questioning whether the system actually works. Nearly half say the system is failing them, up 3 points from last year. 3 in 4 say they feel a sense of injustice. In fact, the majority, 56%, say capitalism as it exists today. They're not saying a root and branch, let's get rid of capitalism. They're saying as it exists today does more harm than good. People clearly want change. And what I find particularly interesting, maybe because I'm a PR man, is this increasing paranoia about misinformation. 57% of people think the media they use, and this is not media that my neighbors use, this is news that I have consumed for a long time. They're worried that it's contaminated with untrustworthy information. And 76% of people worry about fake news being used as a political weapon. That's up 6% from last year. And it's no great surprise that people have this level of distrust and angst, when frankly, they don't trust their leaders to address the challenges that keep them up at night. 2 in 3 people do not have confidence that our current leaders will successfully address their country's challenges. But look at who they do trust, and this is interesting. Of course, they trust the experts, the scientists, and so on. But increasingly, it's my local community or my fellow country people. They certainly don't trust the politicians who are right down there, and I'm sorry to say, Rajan, down there with media as well. And this has resulted in people taking the future into their own hands. There is a groundswell demand for action and change, and it's not going to happen by waiting for our leaders to do it. Never has this been more striking than what's happening in the world today with the Black Lives Matter movement, obviously. So fast forward to last month, and what we did something different this year because of the corona crisis. We looked at, we did a spring update, which was peak lockdown during May. And wow, what a different world we live in now. The levels of trust have shot up 6 points globally, and huge rises in Canada, in Germany, in South Korea, UK, China, and Saudi. But let's not get ahead of ourselves quite yet. It's likely to be a bubble, frankly. In the last 8 years, there have been 17 times when there have been double-digit trust gains. But then 13 out of those 17 went back down again a year later. So clearly, when it comes to trust, we are a fickle race. But whilst we may have greater trust in governments during the pandemic, which is clearly the numbers show that, we worry we are not being kept safe. Only 42% of us think the medical supplies are available, treatments are being made available, and the horrible spectre of fake news is ever more prevalent. People worry fake news is more stark at a time when people are desperate for accurate information. 67% of people worry about the validity of what they read or watch about COVID. And what I find especially interesting, again as a PR guy, is what kind of media people trust right now. And it's good old-fashioned traditional media is right up there at 69%, up 7% actually since January. Whereas social media is right down there at 45%. People really worry that social media is feeding this paranoia about misinformation. So who do people trust now during COVID? Well, of course, it's the experts. It's the doctors, the scientists at 80 and 79% respectively. But there's still that local community sense. More people trust their local governments than they do their country leader, which is a fascinating insight. And this is really a time of reckoning for business. Never has there been such a need for business to do the right thing. This isn't about CSR or ESG or stakeholder capitalism or all those sort of buzzwords that have been discussed at Davos in recent years. It's really about how businesses act right now. That will decide how trusted they are in the future to do the right thing. And look at the numbers. They've got lots of work to do. Only 38% of people think that companies are putting people before profit. 39% of people think they're protecting their employees. And only 38% of people think they're protecting their partners and their suppliers. So to increase trust, business must actively join the fight against COVID, not just in the interest of their own bottom line, but in society's interests. And that's not just donating, but it's collaborating with the competition. That's it's switching production from what they currently make. And most importantly, and it's interesting what Gerald was saying earlier on about the role of businesses in the environmental fight. Most importantly, companies need to redefine their purpose. It's about solutions, not selling. And I threw this in here because I thought it would be quite interesting. What's really, when we look at the sectors that people trust most, it's the essentials that we've been so reliant on in these last few months. It's the great people who have been keeping us fed, safe, sane, and able to communicate with each other as we are now. Those are the sectors who are most trusted at the moment. But look, two sectors we haven't looked at before, so we have no comparison, unfortunately, but we include them here because it's so relevant during this crisis. And frankly, they're two sectors that we all miss so much: hospitality and hotels and airlines. They're at 67% and 64% levels of trust, which is pretty healthy, actually. So in conclusion, as I say, it is a moment of reckoning for businesses and for governments, in fact, for all institutions, including the travel and tourism industry and government ministries. This is not a time for platitudes, it's a time for tangible action. This is not just responding to COVID, but this about how we can all work together to build back better. It's a cliched phrase, but it's relevant. Secondly, it's a time for collaboration, and that's not just collaboration between companies and their competition, but it's also governments and businesses need to collaborate to find sustainable solutions. And corporates need to go back to the basics of what they were established for, that is to serve society. That means living up to their multi-stakeholder promise, not just serving bottom line. And CEOs need to be seen to be taking public leadership, not just leadership within their own company. And lastly, information is going to be critical. As the tourism sector gradually opens up, what people need is credible and constant information to ensure they are not worried about their safety. Vacuums create unease and therefore distrust. And frankly, right now, trust is our most valuable currency. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben. I just want to follow up with one question, which is that you've obviously been doing these trust barometers for a while. In the past, you must have seen rises and blips and whatever, but how do we know how long this will last for? And does it actually have a serious impact on the way we travel?
I think it does, in as much that we are asking questions now that we never asked before about everything, about the way we live our lives. And that's about accountability, but it's also about the products we consume or our experience in the services industry or whatever it may be. And I've heard some of the conversations today around everything from having your rooms cleaned to where you sit in the airline and so on. So I think there's going to be that scrutiny going forward, and people are going to be so much more focused on what people are doing to ensure they're able to sustain that level of trust. And as I say, that's about constant information, that's about transparency, and also two-way conversations. I think I could talk about this forever, but I won't, I promise, is one of the key learnings that come out of all the trust in research we've ever done is brands need to talk with, not at. And if you're just telling people about safety or commitment to tackling the problem, that's not enough. I want you to answer the questions I've got based on my concerns around my community, my family, and me. So I think there's going to be a step change in the way people operate in that way.
Thanks, Ben. Stick around for the conversation.
Yep.
We'll come back to you. I want to turn next to Christopher Rodriguez, a WTTC ambassador, former boss of Visit Britain. Christopher, hello.
Hi.
Nice to see you. What are your views on how the industry will emerge from all this? Just give me a lowdown from your point of view.
I think the point of arrival will be encouraging. I think the product offerings will change. The segments that are people specialize and grow will change. The point of arrival is easy. Getting there is going to be the problem from where we are today. And I think there are briefly a number of points. The first is that whilst we've listened to big employers, the Hiltons, the Marriotts, the IHGs, for example, the airlines, this is predominantly an SME industry. And I can tell you that SMEs don't worry about the big picture, they worry about what's happening to them in their community. And so I think the thing that the industry has to keep reminding government is something that we learned after the financial crisis. The only time I really got through to David Cameron as Prime Minister was when I had one brief soundbite, which is 30% of the new jobs created in Britain after the financial crisis and the following 3 years were created in tourism. And in the bounce back, the reason why governments really do need to get this is that the employment coefficient of tourism is very high, and we've got to get people back into work. So it's not just the fun lovers, it's not just the cocktails on the beach, this is getting the economy going. And for that, you need everyone has been talking about joined up, and Margaux's McKinsey's comment feels absolutely true. The challenge for countries is to be joined up between the public sector, the private sector, the government, and everyone else is involved, and not do inadvertent things that cause major problems. And the issue that many of the developed tourism markets have is that the Minister of Tourism, who needs to be central in the re-energizing of what is going on, often is not a cabinet position and pulls very few of the levers that need to be pulled to make the recovery happen. If you're in a small country like Mauritius, 30% of GDP is in tourism, then the minister gets to slam his shoe on the table like Khrushchev and everyone listens. In Britain, the Minister of Tourism isn't even the cabinet position. So getting heard, getting alignment, just doing all the things we've talked about, and you've had some fantastic info from your other panelists, so I won't go over the ground. I agree with them. Making it happen in a joined up way is going to be what differentiates the winners from the losers at national recovery, and indeed at local recovery, because as Ben was saying, you've got to communicate this. People do not know whether it's a bed and breakfast in Bideford in Devon is a safe place to go or not. And that's a community issue and a local issue as much as it's a national issue.
The other thing I want to ask you about is the price, basically. I think you're worried about the fact that prices are just going to go unaffordably high for people who are already in trouble financially because of unemployment or whatever. Is that the case?
Well, I think there are some, let me break it into two parts. One is we have not seen pervasive price discounting yet to get recovery. And you heard earlier from IHG that and premium properties that dumping product doesn't work for them, and I get that. And I think you saw some of the indication on the McKinsey's charts that if you deep discount, you might get things moving, but there are a lot of things that people need before they need price. So I think the real issue is that this is an industry with high fixed costs and low variable costs. So the cost of just existing before any guests come into a hotel or get on a plane is very substantial. Running this industry at 60% capacity is very, very uncomfortable. We heard earlier about cash being king, and it is in this industry. The only thing that SMEs have in their advantage in this particular segment is SME tourism businesses are often lifestyle. Many bed and breakfasts agritourism businesses are lifestyle choices. They're not looking at return on capital. They're looking at keeping going. And they're actually, if you think of the difference between a big hotel, which is cash constrained, with serried ranks of sun loungers, depending on spring break discounting and making money out of F&B, you might not be terribly excited about that as an investment. You think of an ecotourism lodge which takes 16 people with plenty of space and premium rates. I think they're going to get through this okay. So you're going to see tectonic plates shifting. But what everyone has said, I would just, for 40 years in this industry, you will not take the love of tourism away from the modern world. So the consumer is going to work really hard to get back into the business. Whether we as suppliers can get ourselves and governments can get ourselves joined up is the question for me.
If you had $1 billion or pounds, Christopher, and you had to invest, and you had to invest in tourism, where would you put that money?
I would take a line from Warren Buffett. This is not really what tourism wants to hear. If I was just thinking as an investor, as opposed to someone who's passionate about the success of tourism, I'd invest in the suppliers to tourism. Example, I was exposed yesterday to someone who's got a proximity device that you wear like a watch on your wrist. Well, it's going to be used by retailers and hoteliers. That business is going to, or businesses like it, are going to go gangbusters. Actually running a hotel, a little bit more careful. But I think back down to if you get the new proposition right, then I'd invest. I think, yeah, eco lodges are a good place to be. Serried ranks building on Costa del whatever, I think is a product that may take some time to come back, and I wouldn't add to that pile.
I think it's very interesting what you're saying about investing in supplies, if like, and that includes the workforce. That includes upskilling people in digital skills and knowing how to operate that. And that has come up a few times. And I think it particularly applies to the next guest I want to bring in, Ambassador Do Young Shim from South Korea, because South Korea obviously is way ahead of the game when it comes to tech. And making sure that we get more efficient through using technology and the internet, for example. Can you just tell me, do you see a new paradigm, a new situation, perhaps in South Korea, with how travel will evolve, how the future of travel, really?
Thank you. I've waited about 4 or 5 hours, and before I answer to your question, I want to thank this ITIC for organizing this, Zoom conference. It was very, very useful for me to listen. And then the best part of it is I get to see my friends that I have not seen since January. If it were normal circumstances, we would have seen almost once or every month or once every other month. But anyway, having said this, yes, Korea has managed this COVID-19 situation quite well, but we didn't plan it that way. And one of the, when we didn't have firm control of the border between China and Korea, and Korea was in panic. We didn't know where to go. We didn't know what was coming to us. But at the end of the day, when we looked back, it was a right decision of my government not to completely close the border between China and Korea. Then how well could we, what made us do well so far? I think it's Koreans' DNA that whenever we see crisis coming, we go, government, public sector comes to partners, in true partners. And we are willing to sacrifice our personal liberty, personal movement, if it serves for the good of the public. For instance, the reason we were successful because we were able to test, immediately test, and testing was not a big technology for us because we have been very well prepared. We had documents coming from how we dealt with the MERS situation, 2015, and SARS. And then we had this, once the test was done in such quickest time, then if there's someone who has been tested, affected, but didn't follow this, the rule of containment, we were able to trace them. And I think some of the Western media accused Korean governments doing this, that infringing upon privacy of an individual. But for Koreans, it was natural. It didn't, you know, private citizens, our freedom didn't matter when it was going for public good. And so this, and then to do this, of course, what you have mentioned, technology, our advanced technology, mobile phone, internet, all this helped us getting, so we had a thorough tracing. We just traced anyone who was not following the directive. And then I think the last part is we had a very fine medical system for cure for those who are affected by the coronavirus. We were able to take care of them. So having said this, if I may say, you know, like in tourism before, when we choose tourism destination, we went for shopping, and we went for nice, you know, and the scenery and all this, we went art and everything. But now we are seeing healthcare system. It's not just security. Peter Taleb, you know, he's been very famous keeping a security segment aspect of tourism. But now I'm saying is the medical safety of tourism is very important. I'm going to get into this situation, then where am I going to get proper treatment? You're far away from home, you're just total stranger. So we will look at medical system, and I think that's where Korea won this time, that we do have a medical system, treatment system, that a traveler or Koreans get into this sickness, that we are able to, we have that infra laid down. So with this, I just, you know, enlarge what you have asked me.
Well, Ambassador, I mean, perhaps you can paint me a picture then of the future experience of a tourist to South Korea. I mean, talking, for instance, about health, I mean, will you have, for example, a doctor in every hotel, every large hotel, or people knowing how to get hold of medical assistance as soon as they need it? I mean, when it comes to digitalization, is everything going to be contactless in South Korea in the future? Explain to me.
I'm glad you asked me that question. Yes, we have almost perfect system for that matter. Every hotel, even if it's a small inn, family-run inn, yes, we have a system called Call 119, and that ambulance comes with equipped with the medical personality, and they take us to hospital right away. Of course, we do have some language problem because Koreans do not speak English, but even that, we have the system called use translating system. So, and then we get that. So the communication problem in getting medical, proper medical hospital is all done, and we tell those travelers, yes, if you have any problem, you call 119. And then you have, at the minute you have this call coming, you have to take to the hospital with complete medical equipment.
I didn't actually notice, but Ben, on the Trust Barometer, how was South Korea on the latest figures?
Well, you put me on the spot now. I can't remember. Let me check.
But anyway, it sounds to me like those. Sorry.
Please ask.
No, it just strikes me that those are the kind of things that's going to make a population perhaps trust the authorities, if not necessarily politicians, much more, which is very interesting.
No, it has not. It has nothing to do with politicians. Trusting. Well, I think we're trusting the system, and it's not always politician who brings the system. It's professionals. medicals and nurses and doctors and scientists, and they bring that trust to people, and people are willing to cooperate with them, infringe upon their little bit of, the movement freedom. And I just have to say, I think we've been really lucky in Korea that we were never told to just stay home. There were two things we were asked. Please wear masks. At the minute this broke up. And for us, we're used to wearing masks because a lot of times we get bad air from China, although China might not admit it. So we are used to wearing masks. So wearing masks against coronavirus wasn't something that is totally strange. And second issue is that the mask, and then what we were used to with the whole process is that we have complete system where to call, very simple numbers around. It's in hotels, it's at home, and we can call them, and there's always help at the end of the line. It was fast. It was not like recording comes 20 times, you still hold the line. No, that was very lucky in Korea. We could manage so far. And so we were not able to, we couldn't go out, it was never, we were told just stay home. We were able to do anything except keeping the social distance of 2 meters. And 2 meters were a mask, and that was all the things that government asked us to do. And we never said no to that. We never had arguments, keeping social distance with the mask.
Thank you very much.
Rajan, to answer your question, during the crisis, South Korea went up 8% in level of trust during the crisis, which is very impressive.
Oh, there you go. There you go.
We even have an election. We even have a general election, and we didn't have any problem of transmitting coronavirus.
Okay. Thank you very much. Stay there. I want to go to Haitam Mata, who is a Middle Eastern tourism expert and a CEO of Beyond Tourism, currently advising the Saudis on travel. They've got this big Breathe campaign, which we've talked about before, Haitam. I'm interested in what you think about the two presentations that you've heard from Margaux and from Ben about trust. How much does it apply to your region, do you think?
To a great extent, of course, and I think what Ambassador Doe has alluded to again is the trust in government, the trust in obviously what was shared as well on from a PR perspective on the trust from CEOs and trust from the community. You see that more and more, and I think the fake news that we've seen on social media has really did trigger that diversion to traditional media, as you see a lot of alteration to news, and now when you receive something on social media, you almost need to go back to Google and check to see if it's actually valid or not. And believe you me, 8 out of 10 times it is not valid. It's something that doesn't exist anywhere on any platform. Someone just really photoshopped it. Look, I think this resonates really with the fact that this pandemic has hit us so abruptly. Has impacted our lives in a very different way. People lost jobs, and the trust that's lost is between mostly employees and their employer, right? So unfortunately, many employers took the decision to either terminate employees in service, send them on unpaid leave, reduce their packages or their pay within the first month. So that, not knowing how long this is going to be or the impact of it or the long term of this, decisions were made within the first month to really impact people's lives. So this sort of bitter taste from employees and to employers, where people have served companies for 10, 15, 20 years, right? And they feel they've contributed to the growth of these organizations with their lives, yet they get shafted or they get, sent home within the first month of the pandemic. That trust is broken. And I think one of the paradigm shifts that we're discussing is when when we go back to the new normality, I think people are going to be very selective who they're going to shake hands with and start a new employment, because everyone is going to be worried about their long-term safety and obviously long-term security of their family. Signing contracts that quickly wash away within, a month's time of a pandemic or a crisis is actually going to have a huge paradigm shift on people's choices and who they want to work with. Now, I'm also mindful of the fact that there is some positivity. There's also a huge number of employers who really made efforts to retain employees, and that we can't discount. I think the challenge we have is the view or the lens that you look at this with. There's a larger number of employers who've taken the decision to lay off employees or cut their packages in half than those who worked hard on retaining employees.
I want to ask you, in terms of the Middle East as well, I mean, it strikes me that all the noise is that the Middle East is actually quite well placed to bounce back, probably sooner than most other places. It already had huge ambitions to become a big travel hub. The Saudis entered the fray, obviously Dubai with its airport. Do you think this is I don't mean this in a competitive way, but is this a chance for the Middle East to really impose itself on the travel world?
Look, this is, we've gone through so many crises in the past, and I've been living in the Middle East for the past 20 odd years. And throughout the 20 years, I don't remember a year without a crisis somewhere. But the crises that happened in the past, another country would have benefited from. So let's take, for example, a crisis in Egypt, the UAE benefits from, right? A crisis happens in Jordan, Lebanon benefits from, and vice versa, right? Now, this is a global crisis, which has impacted everyone almost equally. I think the reaction to the pandemic and restore the controls on the spread has been perceived to be probably a little bit more, I want to choose the right word, maybe innovative, let's say that, in some of the Middle Eastern world. Yeah, so Dubai or the UAE in general and Saudi Arabia have been really at the forefront of, taking this really seriously, closing borders, making people work from home, lockdowns, physical distancing, protocols, sanitization, all that throughout, the country. That has shown some levels of control. And now, whilst we still see that rise, and I think, Gerald alluded to earlier, the number of tests in the UAE at 2 million so far, yes, we see a rise in the infected people, but we also see recovery at the same time rising, right? That balance, once we see more of that balance, and once we see more recovery than infections, I think there's going to be much more level of trust in people, going cross borders today. I mean, I live in Dubai. Everything is almost back to normal. People are out, enjoying themselves. Hotels and destinations are promoting staycations and daycations, and people are moving, across the Emirates borders to stay in hotels and spend weekends and what have you. Beaches are open, restaurants are open. Now there's a lot of communication that's going out from the government about, physical distancing, sanitization protocols for restaurants, for hotels, for outdoor events and activities, for us as consumers, if you like. And that's instilling, a lot of trust. But also, as you said earlier, Emirates, the fact that Emirates already has gone, probably 2 weeks ago, launched first 9 destinations. Now it's up to 21 destinations and more to come, has started to instill confidence that people can travel safely. The one component that's kind of worrying everybody now is the quarantine on either side. So if I'm going to come to London and be quarantined for 2 weeks for a 3-day trip, and then come home and get quarantined again for 2 weeks, that's going to be quite a challenge on travel and impacting travel. The way forward really is and I think, I can't remember who said that before on another panel, is these travel bubbles and travel corridors between countries. I don't think that's the way forward. The way forward is that everybody develops these travel corridors and bubbles together, so then the world recovers together. Otherwise, it's the exclusive. You're not included in this, but we are. sort of thing, and that's not going to help the economy bounce back as fast as we need it to.
But just to pick up on that, I mean, if everybody's doing it, it's not a travel bubble or a travel corridor because everyone's opened up. I mean, I know the UK government, for example, I think I've heard this, that they are considering air corridors now for the end of June, and you know, that will be the first step for tourists here to be allowed to go somewhere else. Aren't they a good start?
Look, I mean, look, C-19 is a game changer. It's been a game changer for businesses, for humanity. It's a game changer for destinations, right? When we say, start everything to open up again, we open up, with the right safety levels. If a certain country can do it, I'm saying, why can't the UK do it? Why can't every other country share best practices, learn from what is done right on these? Because I think until today, to be honest with you, I don't think anyone really knows what C-19 is all about. We see messages from the World Health Organization this week that contradicts every other message we've heard before. So there's updates every hour and an hour, and it makes it feel like it's such a long time, right? It's 3-4 months now, 5 months now, and it feels like 5 years because of these regular, updates that you keep getting on the virus. One time you get, you need a mask, you don't need a mask. You actually, you're fine if you just wash your hands. You're fine if you touch hard surfaces, but no, you're not fine if you touch them. So all these change in direction and change in sort of advice from the sort of health leadership is making people go a little bit confused on what do we do, right? You've gone to a risk, and I go back to what Margaux said in hers, which also was picked up before, is what people are saying and what people are doing are sometimes two different things, right? And we'll see this as we go forward. Now people are worried and they say, oh, I'm not going to do this or that. But believe me, as soon as you open the floodgates, people are just out. And because we're human beings, and that's how we are. We're social. We're programmed that way. We can't be confined for too long. So I think it's really, really critical that we keep in mind how this C-19 has affected the game and changed the name of the game, and how this paradigm shift now in everything that we do. Booking pace has changed tremendously to a very, very last minute. We know the Germans and the Britons and the French, they book months in advance. Now they're booking hours in advance. Now there's multiple variables to impact this. One is obviously the change in directions, lockdown open. Abu Dhabi was open, lockdown now, they lock down again, Jeddah's lockdown. So this is making people, do I book? Do I not book? It's uncertainty still.
Fascinating stuff, Aitan. I know we're already over, but I'm really keen to keep this going a little bit longer. I just need a message from someone to say that. And I'm sorry to keep you waiting, Todor, from Bulgaria, but actually you're a very interesting test case in a sense, because obviously tourism is a huge part now of your economy, of the way you see the future of Bulgaria. Give us a quick lowdown as to what's happening at the moment. What's your immediate future?
Well, tourism sector is around 20% of our GDP. So yeah, it's really important. But first of all, allow me on behalf of Minister Angelkova to thank you for your kind invitation and congratulate you on this timely and relevant initiative. Well, our immediate future, it's the domestic tourism so far. Because you see, well, when I say domestic tourism, I mean first Bulgaria, which is usually around 30% of the all tourism yearly. But second, I mean Europe as domestic. For the maybe this and the next year, Europe will be our main market, Bulgaria and Europe. So far, we launched already from 1st of June, because from 1st of June, our, let's say, tourism is open. We opened the beaches, we opened hotels, we opened gardens of restaurants. So we launched a campaign, domestic campaign, that stimulates the tourism here. The second thing that we are doing is reviewing our marketing strategies and plans, because as all the panelists said, we are learning now. We are still learning because we actually don't know what's COVID-19. So as a live organism, as the virus is, we are every day changing our safety protocols, our strategies, our creatives for marketing campaigns. So far we are looking for the markets around, the closest markets that can be reached by car, and secondly by plane, and target them from let's say 1st of July. I believe that most of our competitors like Greece or Turkey or Croatia are actually doing the same. We're following each other because we are at markets and partners and competitors at the same time. So looking for best practices, looking for development of the crisis, and are changing everything every day.
I mean, you've obviously, the country, I mean, has obviously invested literally so much in tourism. You want it to be part of your biggest employers. I presume you've got lots of people right now who aren't working.
More than 11% of the employment.
There you go. You've got a lot of people right now who aren't working. Can you reassure them that tourism will still be a big plank in your future, that you still want to have them working there? You want people to train in tourism and carry on as you were before?
Of course. That's why the first thing that we did is opening, let's say, green corridor for tourism. Reopening the places for dining, the places for going to beaches, for the attractions. Of course, there are certain rules. When you visit those places, of course, you need to follow certain safety protocols. But was the first thing that that was done by the government in terms of taking care of the business, of course. Another thing is that that was done is the VAT for restaurants and actually for serving food. All the connected to tourism businesses like restaurant and cafes. Now in the parliament there are debates about this VAT, and I believe that soon it will be decreased. So this is a big step, really big step in this direction.
Thank you. We've got just a few minutes left on before I get to Taleb, and we'll start winding up and getting our takeaway messages given out to people. But does anybody want to come in on any of the points that they made? Does anybody want to even disagree, actually, for that matter? Please do. We're all happy. I mean, Gerald, are you convinced that the future is travel still?
Yes, absolutely. And one issue that sometimes I'm reluctant to talk about, but now that you've asked me to say something, I do believe as well that, I mean, it's great to see governments in different parts of the world that at this time, in this crisis, they have put the funding, the relief funding directly to the employees. And I think that's so important in our industry. I also believe that there's room to look within our industry at what I like to call, and maybe just in capitalism generally, what I would say would be a rainy day fund. We talk about reserves for FF&E, for example, in our management agreements for running hotels. But do we ever really look at having a fund that is beyond the control of the company that is putting money aside to look after particularly employees in an industry like ours when we hit the rocks like we did in 2020. And I just think that's something that's worth thinking about. I'm not saying it's the answer, but I think a rainy day fund, as I like to call it, is something we should think about.
Okay, I am going to thank you, Gerald. I am going to wind up now. It's a shame because we could have had so much more conversation. When we're back to the real world, I want you all in one room, and we're all going to talk together, socially distancing, of course. But just hammer this one out over for about 3 hours.
Just to say, Rajan, remind everybody that we will be having our ITIC conference, hopefully just before the WTM physical exhibition in London in the last weekend in October, so don't forget that.
And before that is that in our event in September. So hopefully I'll see you all there.
Ah, fantastic.
Excellent.
Even before that, Toda. Thank you
Even
very
before
much.
that.
Anyone beat that?
Obviously.
No. Thank you so much. One thing that occurred to me from all of this. Oh, go on. Sorry. Yes.
No, I just amazing. Are you WTM is actually going to be held in London? Are you expecting in November?
We're going to get Simon Press on in a minute from the WTM. I think that is the aim, yes. And he will talk a bit more about that, Ambassador. So that, yeah, so I think your question will be answered shortly. The one thing that occurred to, sorry, go on.
You think we'll be able to travel without 14 days of quarantine by November?
That's the question. That is obviously a major question. I'm not allowed to comment on that, but it's a long way away, is all I will say. And I think that quarantining might be something, unless we have a second wave, a problem of the past. We're hoping. The one thing that occurred to me, by the way, is that if you are a small company or any kind of company in travel, you should put on your board either a nurse or a doctor or somebody medical to be a non-exec director or something, because that's immediately going to raise the profile and make it trustworthy, as we keep talking about. Okay, thank you all so much.